Okay, let's go ahead and begin. First of all, welcome everyone who's joining us out there in Zoom land. My name is Jack Jackson. I'm a member of the politics department here at Whitman. And it's my real pleasure to be hosting tonight's event and introducing our lecturer, who is joining us virtually as our visiting educator in law this year. Professor Mark Golub is an associate professor at Scripps College, and he specializes in critical race theory, constitutional law, and African-American political thought. His writing has appeared in a wide array of academic journals, and he's the author of a recently published book called Is Racial Equality Unconstitutional, published by Oxford University Press in 2018. Before handing it over, I'd also like to acknowledge those who've made possible tonight's visiting educator in law, in particular, the Robert and Mabel Grosclose Endowed Lecture Fund, the Politics Department, and the Pre-Law Program. I'd also like to note that tonight's lecture is part of this year's academic theme on race, violence, and health. And I'll now hand this over to Professor Golub, who will deliver a lecture for about 40 minutes. After the lecture is concluded, we'll have 20-25 minutes for question and answer period. Chat is turned off, so if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A box on your screen. And now I'll hand this over to Professor Golub, whose lecture tonight is titled Race, Riot, Rebellion, Rethinking Rule of Law in Times of Mass Protests. Professor Golub, welcome to Whitman.
Great, thanks so much, Jack. I guess I should say thanks for the introduction and for inviting me to be part of this series, which looks like it's going to be terrific and timely and bring all kinds of smart people to campus. And then I also want to thank Jack for the very nice review of my book, which he wrote for Theory and Event, and for making explicit all of the latent Marxist critique that was there in my book and bringing it out for everyone to see. So thanks for that. Above all, I want to thank everybody for coming out. I know that everybody is probably feeling a bit stir crazy and Zoom sick, and we're spending way too much time on screens. So it's actually quite amazing that you're here to listen to this lecture when there are other things that you could be doing. I really appreciate that. So I know that Zoom's not an ideal format. What I've done is I've tried to put together some interesting visual to try to keep it moving. And I'll ask everybody to just sort of keep your eye on the big picture rather than getting bogged down in the details. And I say this by way of emphasizing that what I'm going to say tonight is not meant just as an academic exercise, although it certainly has a fair amount of political theory in it, but it's rather meant as an intervention that is a challenge to how we typically talk about the rule of law and its relationship to large structural forces, in particular, large structural forces that keep over 2 million people incarcerated, locked in cages, and something more like 8 million people if we think about all of the folks in the United States who are under state supervision. So I want this talk to be useful not just to political theorists, but to anybody who's concerned about this system that we live in and wants to know more about what it is that keeps us invested in maintaining it. But before we can talk about the rule of law in our current era of mass protest on the left and right, we need to say more about what we mean by law. And I will start some slides. And I will also start my stopwatch. Okay. So the first thing that we need to do, I think, is I want to talk about how we might usually how people tend to talk about law when we do talk about law. And the sort of two basic approaches that tend to get invoked are those of natural law and legal positivism. And we don't need to go into all of the details, but roughly natural law speaks of universal principles, sometimes coming directly from the divine, sometimes associated with universal reason. So that would be natural law. And it's compared with people who are interested in talking about legal positivism, which is thinking about law more as an authoritative command. It's law as practiced empirically rather than in its moralistic guise. And so ideally, when state and federal laws are consistent with principles of justice, these views will align. But in both cases, legal meaning is understood to be fixed and discoverable. It's a clear point of origin that can be looked up, for instance, as in this book being held by Charlton Heston. Compare that to a different take. So this is not how we ordinarily think about law, but rather a challenge to that conception, which I'll be using, in which I'm drawing from the legal scholar Robert Cover, who published several important pieces, but the one I'm interested in is an article, a law review called Nomos and Narrative. And in that article, Cover says that once understood in the context of the narratives that give it meaning, law becomes not merely a system of rules to be observed, but a world in which we live. In this normative world, law and narrative are inseparably related. So there are a couple points. This is a counterintuitive way of thinking about the law, perhaps, but nomos, which is just the Greek word for law, is associated here with narration because the law is, on Cover's view, a way of making sense of the world that we live in together, a way of interpreting collectively. So it's foremost an interpretive practice. And you could think about this in relationship to violence, where what counts as law is going to be a product of a different narrative framework that divides the world up, such that some acts of violence will look like crime or disruption, and other acts of violence will look like the restoration of law, or will simply disappear as violence and will count as law itself. So I'm going to be especially interested in this narrative element of law and what I have to say tonight. But there are two parts of the theory in particular that I want to call our attention to. One is called juris genesis, and one is called juris pathos. So juris genesis is a fancy name combining juris, law, and genesis, creation. So it's the creation of legal meaning. And there are two important parts here. The first is that thinking about juris genesis calls attention to the way that law is a shared interpretive commitment rather than, for instance, a command or a rule. So it's always going to be something that's evolving and changing, but it's rooted in the communities that people live, and it's an interpretation of the world that we share collectively. And what follows from that, the second part of the definition of juris genesis that Cover offers, which is equally important, is that nomos, as he understands it, quote, requires no state, end quote. And what that means is that while we might think about law emanating from sources of authority, the state, judges, perhaps lawyers, the book that Charlton Heston is holding when he's playing the role of Moses, that in fact, the way that Cover describes it is that there are multiple and competing nomoi, multiple sources of law, and that law is made not from the state, but it's made from the people who are actually living in the world in their own ways. So law is made also in protests, in social movements, and in the streets. And when we think about law and its jurisgenetic form, that also means that it changes our understanding of what it is that courts are actually doing. So for example, we might think about courts not as creating legal meaning, as we typically do, but instead we could think about them as in fact having the job of juris pathos, which simply means the destruction of legal meaning. So Cover writes that interpretation always takes place in the shadow of coercion. Even if it doesn't look that way, courts are practicing a kind of institutional violence. And courts, at least the courts of the state, he says, are characteristically jurispathic. So here you can see this scene from the Ten Commandments in which what looks like the lawgiver, Moses with his tablets, is in fact looking out at competing sources of legal authority. That is the celebration, the worshiping of the golden calf that we see in the wild party down below as he returns from Sinai. And I think the image is really good at emphasizing or illustrating for us the importance of thinking about law as jurispathic, because it means that the problem isn't just a distinction between the lawful and the lawless. It is rather a competition between competing notions of what will count as law. And the role of the courts is to harness up all of the monopolization on the legitimate use of violence in order to suppress other forms or other sources of law, so juris pathos. Which brings us to the question that I want us to talk about tonight, armed with this conception of Robert Cover's notion of juris genesis and juris pathos. And that has to do with the role of law in times of mass protest. So you might be anticipating this already from my remarks on what Robert Cover says, Because if illegal meaning is in fact created in the streets, in protest, and in violence, you might notice that we're also currently living in a moment of mass protest, and a moment where violence seems to be around the corner at every turn, connected up to politics in disturbing and unnerving ways. So my questions that I want to talk about tonight are twofold. First, how does the rule of law structure our understanding of policing and mass protests against police violence? And also, how does the rule of law structure our understanding of the more recent right-wing violence, such as the Capitol riots of January 6th? But of course, these protests don't come out of thin air. They respond to something. So before we look at the responses in the mass protests, I think it's important to take a moment to look at the source of these conflicts. And in particular, I now want to look at images of several people killed by the police around which the mass mobilizations occurred. So this is Michael Brown, and you can see the results of police violence on the right. Michael Brown killed by police on August 9th, 2014. And this is Tamir Rice, killed while playing in a playground on November 22nd, 2014. And Sandra Bland, killed in police custody July 13th, 2015. And George Floyd, killed on May 25th, 2020. And Breonna Taylor, killed by the police on March 13th, 2020. And of course, in addition to these, we have to ask how many more, how many were not captured on video, how many are still to come. All of these I want to present as the unnarrated or uninterpreted facts of police killing in the United States, which we might also say is a fact of Black life in America. And our question then, as we try to make sense of this situation, we need to know how it is that these deaths are typically understood. Or as Robert Cover might put it, how is it that we tend to narrate these deaths and give them meaning and attach them to systems of interpretation that will do certain kinds of political work? Or to put it slightly differently, the meaning of these deaths is not self-evident, even in the most gruesome photographs. For instance, what we saw on the right side of the image with George Floyd. Rather, these images require interpretation, and that interpretation is always contested. It is always the product of political work, and it's our job to understand that political work. So, the frameworks. There tend to be two frameworks, and you can just sort of check with yourself to see if this resonates with the sorts of media that you're consuming or the sorts of conversations that you have with friends or family or strangers or on the internet. But roughly speaking, we can call them conservative and liberal. And in response to these sorts of highly publicized, spectacular scenes of anti-Black violence, there tends to be a conservative narrative that will justify the police, and we'll talk about the use of force justified by criminal threat. Very often this is associated with a sort of criminalizing language around Blackness or defaming of the victims of police violence. And it's also coupled with an assertion that what motivated the violence was in fact not racial. There's always a refrain, that there must be something else, that this wasn't motivated by race. And on the other hand, this narrative is countered by liberals who insist that the deadly force used by the police is in fact illegal, that they do not have the right to act in this manner, that it violates the law, that they've behaved wrongly and illegally. And sometimes there's a demand for punishment, that is the call to jail killer cops, which insists upon the illegality of the violence that we were just looking at. And very often this is associated with or attached to a claim that race is indeed the motivating factor for this sort of anti-Black violence. That's what makes it anti-Black. And as a result, we are able to see the illegitimacy of the violence that's being deployed. Now, while those might seem to be, in fact, antithetical frameworks, completely at odds with one another. Liberals and conservatives seem to agree on nothing. In fact, I want to say that these are really narratives that convene, that there are shared elements of these liberal and conservative framings, and that both of them view the violence as an aberration, and they both view violence as a deviation from law. That is, the question is, for both liberals and conservatives within these frameworks, the question is, can we say that the way that the police officer acted was within the law or outside of the law when the violence occurred? And in both cases, what that means is that the violence, when it occurs, or I should say the problem, is a problem to the extent that it deviates from the law. So for conservatives, there's not a problem, the violence was lawful. And for liberals, what makes it problematic is attached to its deviation from law. And in both cases, the result is to frame these police shootings viewed as singular incidents or as events, to which there is then a response. So, for example, in the case of the killing of Michael Brown, what we see on the left we qualify as an incident. Something happened. And on the right, what we see is a response to that event, which is the mobilization of mass protests, which gets reported on in the popular press very often with the language of riot. So you can see at the bottom of the Daily News that the president is calling for calm as Ferguson burns. Now, I think that there's an important element of this framework, which I'm going to go ahead and call triangulation, because as you can see, even in this initial set of images, the way that the framing of this violence takes place might lead one to think that law is being figured here as a response to two different kinds of violence, or that there's violence that occurs, two different sources or threats of violence, and both of which the law is offered as a solution to or response. So you could think about how the screen is in fact sort of split down into three parts here. On the far left, you'll see what we might see as one kind of violence, which is the violence of the police who have murdered Michael Brown. And on the right, you can see another threat of violence, which would be the violence of riot or of street violence, in this case, from the community against the police who killed Michael Brown. But in the center is that category of lawfulness that is policing as it is meant to be practiced, or policing when it doesn't go terribly wrong, perhaps policing most of the time in the view of most Americans. And that central category of lawfulness is shared by both the conservative and the liberal framings, which is why I call this triangulation. And I've created this graphic in order to illustrate it, because what we can see is that in that central category, the law remains pure or innocent of the violence which it condemns. On the left, we have the police misconduct. We could also talk about illegal or unwarranted use of force, the fact of the racial motivation. And on the right, you have a different source of violence. On the left, some people will refer to this as a kind of white violence. On the right, a kind of black violence, which is the violence of protests, or riots, or looting, or mob rule, which in reporting in this country are always racialized as black. And in that centerpiece, you have the law, which ceases to function as law as it crosses that boundary on either of the sides. Now, I should say that this triangulation, in fact, goes very far back. I can trace it all the way back to anti-slavery campaigns, in which you might find that the central category of law could find itself being both against slavery for being a violation of natural law, and also against abolition, because while condemning slavery, anti-slavery activists might also condemn the sorts of actions that would be necessary to transform the material conditions to create authentic Black freedom. And we see a similar sort of triangulation at work in the civil rights movement, which is where I want to start tracing this out. So what's going to follow is some examples that show this kind of triangulation at work historically in the United States. And the first place I want to look at is triangulation in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, which at first right? These images are probably familiar to people. I'm guessing that everybody has seen the use of the police dogs or fire hoses turned on peaceful protesters in the civil rights movement. So at first it might look like there isn't any triangulation happening at all. There are actually only two forces. There's the forces of police violence, and there's the protesters who are absorbing that violence in their bodies. But in fact, if you, for instance, look at Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail, you'll find that he's responding to a kind of framing from white moderates who do exactly the sort of triangulation that I was just describing. So he's responding to two statements from white ministers who he'd hoped to work with and realizes that he cannot. On the left, we have the first statement, the white minister's law and order statement of January 16th, in which they say, "We feel that defiance is neither the right answer for the solution, and we feel that inflammatory and rebellious statements can lead only to violence, discord, confusion, and disgrace for our beloved state." I want to point out that the defiance and the rebellious statements that the white ministers are referring to are actually not the civil rights protesters. They're referring to the forces of massive resistance. The defiance that they have in mind would be white political leaders who refuse to accept the legitimacy of the Brown versus Board of Education school desegregation decision. And the rebellious statements that lead to violence that they're referring to is a fear of white mobs and street crime in the form of either it's the Klan or other just white mobs that would mobilize in order to prevent the actualization of school desegregation. By the time we get to April 12th, however, the white ministers have changed the target of their concern, and they write instead, "Just as we formerly pointed out that hatred and violence have no sanction on our religious and political traditions," referring to massive resistance and white violence, "we now also point out that such actions as incite to hatred and violence, however technically peaceful those sanctions may be, have not contributed to the resolution of our local problems." So here, the source of violence is in fact the civil rights protesters themselves, who are framed as bringing in disruption, conflict, and violence along with their protest. The reason I call this triangulation is because the center category now gets filled with the values of Southern moderates. So on the left, we have Southern moderates condemning as lawlessness the work of the white mobs, massive resistance, the Klan, and lynching. And on the right, they condemn the violence, the Black violence of the civil rights movement, of street protest, and of civil disobedience, leaving the central category of law, or I should say claiming the central category of law, by which they mean gradualism, token integration, and the way of avoiding desegregation orders through privatization, so that you could still have totally segregated schools as long as they were private schools or private spaces or businesses or these sorts of things, right? So Southern moderates are laying claim to the law and denouncing the violence on either side of the extremists. And this helps us to understand the tactic of the civil rights movement, which is to change that framing, or to retriangulate, we might say, so that on the left, we have white violence now, not just in its more extreme, open, or thuggishly brutal formulations, but the whole legal apparatus of segregation, which the civil rights movement framed as itself, in fact, unlawful. So segregation now falls on the left, and that movement from the right of Black violence, civil rights movement now lays claim to the law in the form of peaceful protests. But of course, this framing only works if you triangulate. So at the same time that civil rights leaders are claiming the central category of innocence and lawfulness, they push not only against the disruption of white violence on the left side of your screen, but they also identify Black nationalism, Black power, defense by every means necessary, as a kind of Black violence on the right, which they can disidentify from in order to claim that central category of law. Now, before we turn to, I guess I should hold this for 1 second longer. Before we turn to the contemporary examples that I want to look at, I think it's worthwhile to ask whose framing we think in the end won out. That is, does common sense today, when we think about rule of law, look more like this, as the Southern moderates framed it? Or does it look more like this, as civil rights leaders framed it? And I think, to the extent that we still live in a world in which segregation and discrimination, anti-Black violence are all formally illegal, and yet the material conditions of white supremacy continue, I think I want to make the claim that, in fact, it was the white moderates whose framing won out. And I'm going to try to show that in the next slides that we look at, starting with the events in Los Angeles in 1991 and 92 surrounding the police murder of Rodney King. So I've already framed it up by calling it a murder, but of course that's the question that's under investigation. And these images are taken from the police body cameras. I think they were actually, I'm sorry, they're not from police body cameras. These were taken from across the street, somebody who had a handheld camera, which in 1991 was extremely unusual, but now it's been replaced by body cameras or dash cameras for police. And it might look that what we're looking at here, it might seem that this is totally self-evident, right? We see a number of police officers standing over the body of Rodney King. We can see them in these still frames, lowering their batons onto his body, striking him with full force. If you look carefully, you can see a white line that moves from across from the police officer under that arrow in the top left and attaches to Rodney King's body, and that's the taser, which is shooting electrical current into his body while he's being beaten, which seems like an extreme form, and it would speak for itself. And yet, what we know is that the police officers who attacked Rodney King in this way, we know that they were exonerated, that they were not found guilty in a court of law. And one of the things that we have to ask is why. I think that the language triangulation will help us do that. So we have both an incident and response kind of individualistic framing. Rather than thinking about the systemic nature of the problem, we're looking at a particular action and wondering whether it's lawful or lawless. And again, we can divide it up into these sorts of three categories. We can triangulate. So the violence on the left, and this would be maybe for people who feel that the police officers should not have been acquitted. We can see on the left a language of lawlessness associated with reckless police behavior, in which case policing in itself is not seen as problematic. It's only a certain kind of especially brutal policing, when policing goes too far or uses unapproved techniques or acts in a racist way. Then it becomes an incident of white violence, which is marked as this crossover beyond the threshold of law. So you can see the newspaper saying it's LA lawlessness. But on the right, you can see the response to the acquittal of Officer Stacey Koon, in which Los Angeles erupts in what many people refer to as a riot. And importantly, what that does is it creates a sort of false association or a false equivalency, such that the violence on the left and the violence on the right both appear to be condemnable. So that in the center category, courts working the way that they should, some people think to exonerate Stacey Koon, other people say to have found him guilty would have been effective working, but in both cases, it's that legal apparatus in the middle, which is the safe, innocent space of the lawful, and violence on both sides is a departure from the law. And what that means is it creates a false equivalency such that the response to police violence is made to seem as if it is equal as, or perhaps even worse than, the systemic violent policing of LA's Black and brown populations. Which leads to the question of how we should understand what follows in the aftermath of the acquittal. That is to say, should we think about this as a riot at all, which falls into that triangulation and pairs with a sort of symmetrical response to the violence of police lawlessness? Or would it make more sense to think of what's happening here not as lawless riot, but in fact as an organized collective community response, a kind of spontaneous insurrection against oppressive conditions? The language of insurrection comes from Maxine Waters, and it's been picked up by critical race theorists and other Black activists. And the people I'm quoting here, Crenshaw and Peller, critical race theorists, write it this way, quote, "But most across the spectrum of mainstream culture who deplored the rioting didn't do so because they agreed with the verdict or with the cheering police. To the contrary, for the most part, they sought to preserve the very value that they thought the Simi Valley jury had impugned, the value of the rule of law." In other words, there's this middle category in which people are able to condemn both the civil unrest that occurs in Los Angeles, that's typically referred to as riots, and also condemn the conditions that give rise to it. That is, much like the anti-abolitionists, one could condemn slavery and also condemn the material change that would be necessary to create conditions of Black freedom. Similarly, we condemn the conditions of anti-Black policing and also responses to anti-Black policing at the same time. Triangulation. And I think you can see the same thing happening in the Ferguson protests in 2014, although sometimes we're trying to be spared of this distinction by distinguishing rather between rioting on the one hand and peaceful protests on the other. Although when I look at these images, it's not clear to me exactly how to draw that line or to make that distinction clear. And similarly in Baltimore in 2015, the murder of Freddie Gray, where it's unclear what we're looking at here is a riot or a rebellion, or with the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020. These are taken from Los Angeles, so I was in these streets as well. And I think we can see the kind of triangulating occurring and also start to identify the stakes of what's misleading about this sort of traditional rule of law understanding of what we're looking at. So in response to the recent police protests or protests against police violence, you might say that what we have on the left is a denunciation of policing gone wrong, killer cops, police brutality, the chemical weapons used on protesters. I'm sure many of you saw the abusive practices that the police deployed against nonviolent protesters. And on the right, one also might condemn as unlawful the burning of police cars or looting or throwing bottles at the police. But my question is, what is in this middle category? What exactly is in this space that's presented as innocence or narrated as nonviolent because it is lawful rather than violence? So of course we get the peaceful protests here, but it also opens the category of policing done the right way rather than done wrong. And this is the part that concerns me most of all, because what it takes off of the table is precisely the violence that occurs through the law, the violence that occurs when policing is doing exactly what it's supposed to do and not when something has gone terribly wrong. So this is the primary implication of what I want to talk about here. And I think it has really two forms. The first is that it misdirects our response to systemic violence, or it takes systemic violence off of the table completely. So one way that we might talk about it is we might notice that the reform efforts focus on improved policing rather than, for instance, diminishing the scope of policing or even defunding or abolishing the police. These reform efforts, which seek to improve policing, might often have the effect of, in fact, extending the reach of the policing. So for instance, there's an LAPD report on the mishandling of the 2020 protest that just recently came out, and I've been looking at it. And sure enough, while condemning the heavy-handed response of the police for attacking protesters, the solutions or the reforms that the LAPD report, it's an independent report on LAPD abuses, the sorts of reforms that they suggest or that they call for invariably turn to things like a need for increased training of police, a need for more police so that they won't be overstaffed, a concern that the police were sleep deprived and therefore making bad decisions, a concern that they weren't properly trained on what sorts of charges to level against the protesters, which would justify a mass incarceration, a failure of planning for mass arrests that would be necessary in the face of these protests. This is something that Naomi Murakawa calls liberal law and order, in that rather than seeking to dismantle or to reduce the size of the police state, the carceral system, instead what we're looking for is ways to protect it, improve it, and often that means sending more RISs that way. Another way of thinking about it, you might hear this language in other places as well, is to move us from thinking about acts of police violence, that is, when police act in openly violent ways, to instead start thinking about the violence of policing. That is, the violence that policing does, even when everything happens smoothly, when it's working exactly the way that it's supposed to work. That is, doing what it's supposed to do, which is surveilling and controlling marginalized populations, cleaning up after the contradictions of racial capitalism and that sort of thing. There's also a hopeful element here, though, and that is, just as the middle category of law is vacated of its violence through our traditional framing, by looking at it through the language of jurisgenesis, we can see it in a different way. And that is that these sorts of jurispathic reforms that I've just described fail to capture the legitimate demands for structural change from the protesters. In other words, the kinds of reforms that we end up turning to are meant, in fact, to delegitimize more radical calls for change. And so by thinking about it through a lens of jurisgenesis, we might instead be able to see what's happening on the streets, not as a riot, but rather, and not to minimize the scope or extent of the movement demands, but rather to see social movements as a source of jurisgenesis or as a source of legal authority. Which brings us to this problem, which is, we don't have to call it revolutionary, we can just call it jurisgenic. That is, if we're willing to see social movements as sources of new law, and if we're willing to get excited about the possibility of transformational change coming from those sorts of protests, and we're willing to see how that comes out of recognition of the protesters as a legitimate source of legal authority, whereas the state is practicing its jurisπathic techniques, it brings us to this difficult question, which is, do we have to make similar kinds of claims of recognition about what we're looking at here, as you see far-right white nationalist forces gathered at the Capitol building itself? So we might think of this as a sort of limiting category, or maybe this is a bad case that I have to take on if I'm going to make the kind of argument that I'm making. How do we feel about the idea of recognizing this group as a source of its own distinct nomos, a nomos that I'm guessing few of us on this particular Zoom session would embrace? In other words, just as we had to ask whether what gets called the LA riots or the denunciation of Black Lives Movement protesters as rioters, remember Tucker Carlson likened them to Hezbollah, what happens if we have to then face the question of whether what we're looking at here is a riot, or is there also some element that we might think of as the events of January 6th also as being a rebellion or an insurrection? And I don't mean to settle this issue in any way, but I do think that my approach to the rule of law can help us understand this response. Also, I think that we might be making the same sorts of mistakes of legalism or asking the rule of law to save us from something that it cannot save us from in the way that we've been responding to it thus far. So the first thing I want to do is I want to talk about, or I just want to call our attention quickly to the extent to which we lean on this language of rule of law to restore order. And this is by casting the rioters, the Trump protesters, or the militia leaders, militia groups, to cast them as lawless. So one example of that here is, and I'm sure you've seen this, the extensive circulation of images. Here we have FBI releasing images and seeking information. And the result of this is to frame them as individuals who have committed crimes. Those crimes need to be punished. They fall under the category of lawless. And so what we need most of all is to have them arrested, brought back to justice so that law can be restored. A fine example of this actually was, I don't know how many of you watched the impeachment hearings, that here is a screenshot that I took while I was live streaming it through the New York Times. And if you haven't seen these images, they're actually quite remarkable. I think that it's important to notice that, or to note that the language of impeachment is itself a legal proceeding. They have charges and it's framed as a trial. What we have here is a framing of Trumpism itself as in fact a violation of law. So it's an association of Trumpism with lawlessness, or to counter the forces of the far right through the power of law. And there are two things that I want to point out here. The first is we have the commentator, sorry, one moment, Sabrina Tavernise, who's writing for the New York Times, who's live blogging it, I believe. And she's sort of talking with Lisa Lehrer, another commentator, about how strange it is that people didn't take efforts to conceal their faces, either because of coronavirus or to escape detention. That is, they don't appear to be trying to get away with a crime. And in fact, she notes that they didn't realize that they were in fact standing in the middle of a giant crime scene. Later, she notes that the people seemed to be proud. They were expressing pride that they were there, and they circulated images of themselves in this crime scene. Why? Because they believed that they were patriots. The language that the New York Times uses for this is unreality. That is, they failed to understand the situation that they're in. But a more cynical reading, or I guess a reading inconsistent, that would be more consistent with cover, would be to say that in fact they would not have been wrong, it would not be unreal, and that they would have been considered patriots had they succeeded. Maybe this is cynical, or maybe it's simply obvious to point out. We see a similar kind of logic here from historian Timothy Snyder, although I think it's quite revealing. Snyder writes that Trump's coup attempt of 2021, like other failed coup attempts, is a warning for those who care about the rule of law and a lesson for those who do not. His pre-fascism revealed a possibility for American politics. For a coup to work in 2024, the breakers will require something that Trump never quite had: an angry minority organized for nationwide violence, ready to add intimidation to an election. 4 years of amplifying a big lie just might get them this. To claim that the other side stole an election is to promise to steal one yourself. So in one sense, what he's saying is that the people who are attacking the Capitol building are people who do not care about the rule of law. That is, they care about their own power. That's what makes them fascist. It's power above all. But at the same time, he points out that it's a lesson for those who do not care about the rule of law. And this lesson is what opens up a kind of political possibility. And it's a political possibility from which I recoil, of course, but a possibility nonetheless. That is, he imagines that 4 years from now, after repeating the big lie over and over again, enough people might insist on enforcing it, and the failed coup of 2020 might become a successful coup in 2024. But to read it that way insists again that what would be happening is stealing, where the only question is what will prevail, law or lawlessness. But in fact, we might also see that what's happening on the part of the rioters is an insistence upon their own source of legal meaning. That is, it's a desire to create a legal order which most of us reject. And so the last few, I just have a few more slides. I don't want to go more than a minute or two over, but I do want to point out that in the images that we're going to look at of these protesters, I think that the difficulty of distinguishing the lawful from the lawless comes up in the repetition of and fixation on images of law breaking that are offered by the popular media, which in fact, from the perspective of the rioters or of the insurrectionists, are themselves signs of law. So for example, here, we're looking at some of the insurrectionists outside the Capitol building before they break in, and the caption on the photograph notes that there are two things that are disturbing about it. One is the flashing of the white supremacy sign, which immediately invalidates the legality of these actions for those of us who believe in racial equality. but of course would just do the exact opposite for somebody who believes or holds a nomos, which is rooted in white supremacy explicitly. But more importantly for the caption of this photograph, they point out the wearing of the tactical vest and the chemical weapons that are attached to it in the form of pepper spray gel, right? The media names the extent of the crime by showing the level of organization and the willingness to use violence to get their way. From the media's perspective, in this image at least, that is a sign of illegality. But of course, we also have just been looking at images of how the police responded to protesters precisely by using chemical weapons like the pepper spray gel that this person is carrying. So weirdly, in a different context, the wielding of that weapon would in fact be the thing which identifies the agent as an agent of law. Pepper spray is enforcing law and putting down a rebellion. And in this case, the question is whose side of the rebellion is one on. Similarly, I'm sure that people have seen this image as well, right? And this one is especially scary because what this insurrectionist is holding in their hand is these zip ties. And repeatedly we're told in the media that this is frightening because those zip ties are used to hold people as captives, right? This is for kidnapping, to taking hostages, especially when people are chanting "Hang Mike Pence" and seem to be actively looking for him. And I don't mean to diminish how frightening that perspective is or that prospect is, but at the same time, I want to point out that where I encounter, and many of you might also have encountered these zip ties most frequently, is if you ever join in a mass protest, because the police officers carry these zip ties around and they're used for the efficient administration of taking protesters and putting them in these zip ties as sort of impromptu handcuffs before they're carted off in vehicles. The same image, which for the police is a sign of their legality here, is for the media a sign of lawlessness, but no doubt for the insurrectionists is a stepping up into the status of law or taking that on for themselves. And then the last image I just want to show here is the famous image of the gallows around the Capitol building, right? Which from the media's perspective and from mine as well, looks like a sign of a kind of, lynch law or mob justice or something like this. But what I think is so interesting here is, while it's true that the gallows and the hanging noose is in fact an indication of how serious and extreme and how seriously we should take these sorts of insurrectionist movements, at the same time, the scaffold that's been erected here is not typical for what we might call a murder, the crime of murder. Rather, it places that violence in a particular context. That is, it is theatrical, it is staged, and it is spectacular. It is meant to be looked at. So that the important thing about this image from the perspective of the protesters, and this is something that I would share, is not the fact of the violence, but rather the narrative frame around it. That is, how that violence will be made sense of, how it will be made meaningful. And that means that we should be taking seriously as a source of jurisgenesis these sorts of social movements of the far right. Another way of putting that is, just while I wanted to resist the efforts to diminish the kinds of claims of the Black Lives Matter anti-police violence protests by legalizing them or reducing them down to the law and depriving them of their of a source of legal authority, I similarly think that we should do the same thing here. That is, that we should be cautious not to respond to the problem of far-right militia movements by thinking that the rule of law is something that can protect us from it, by denouncing it as outside of the boundaries of law. But instead, we should think about the particular dangers and perils that such a movement has. As Robert Cover says, law is a way of life or a way of making meaning. What's at stake here is a confrontation not with the illegality of the acts of the insurrectionists, but rather with the nomos that they're trying to create. Okay, that is my presentation. I think I think I went a few minutes over, but that should still leave us plenty of time for questions.
Great, thank you so much, Mark. If those in the audience have questions, please put them in the Q&A and I'll present them to Professor Golub. Maybe just to get the conversation started, I'll start with my question, Mark. You started off, or one of your historical points in your narrative was Birmingham, and you reference Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail. And as you know well, King argued for principled nonviolence and thought that that was in fact one of the defining issues of political life in contemporary times, whether or not one embraced violence or nonviolence. Am I reading you correctly that you simply reject that as a non-starter of a question, violence and nonviolence, and that we have to simply reject King's teaching on nonviolence, embrace violence, and the question now really is which narrative as opposed to violence or nonviolence? Or do you want, or am I misinterpreting?
I think, well, let me put it this way. I think I would reject the terms of your question, right? That is, while it is true that Dr. King, as he said, adopts the principle of nonviolence as a condition of political engagement, I think he did that for tactical reasons as well as moral reasons. But setting that aside, the way you framed that was that the choice then is a choice between embracing violence or refraining from violence, that's the choice. And when you frame the question that way, it makes it seem as if what counts as violent is already evident. And the only choice that we face is whether to use it or not use it, to use it or to refrain. But in fact, if you think about the sort of strategic value of nonviolent direct action that King was so masterful at, the goal was in fact just the opposite of that. The goal was to take a situation in the world that was saturated with violence, but not recognized as violent, right? It just looked ordinary. It looked like the world of the Southern moderates, whose quote I put up earlier on the slide, right? And the goal was to use nonviolence in a way that would bring out that violent meaning and to recognize it as such. So I guess I would say, well, personally, I don't have any particular stake in the question of what tactics to use, and I think they might change in different particular historical circumstances. The thing that I would insist upon is that we do not ask whether to be violent or not, but rather we think about how to act in ways that will call attention to that interpretive contest, the battle over what will count as violence and what will count as law.
Wonderful, thank you. So I will now head to Q&A. Conversations about police violence rarely mention the fact that because the US permits ordinary citizens to own and carry guns, the police may be heavy-handed or overreact in many situations. There seems to be a fundamental lack of trust between the police and ordinary citizens, especially Black citizens, more than might be the case in another country. Could you comment about that?
Yeah, I would be happy to comment about that. And the lack of guns is, the presence of guns is especially interesting if you think about the kind of comparison between the two sets of images that I just set out earlier, right? So on the one hand, the sort of like white nationalist protesters that stormed the Capitol, guns are everywhere. But you'll also notice that the sorts of protests that happened at the Black Lives Matter protests, you do not see guns around. The only people with guns there are the police. And so I think I want to use that observation to both recognize something that seems right to me in the question. That is, there is a fundamental lack of trust. And I think we can be sympathetic to the sort of like dangerous situation that police encounter, but I would be loath to frame it as a lack of trust being the source of the problem. In other words, what needs to, I can put it this way. Imagine that we think about how it is that the police and the communities that they're policing have a failure to trust one another, and we think about sort of practical ways that we could build trust up. In fact, those techniques would look a lot like the kinds of liberal law and order that Naomi Murakawa writes about, or we could think about the sorts of funding efforts to do publicity campaigns or PR. I know that at my daughter's school, there's a ride your bike to school, and then the police show up, they hand out stickers, and that is a way of building up trust in the community. But if I'm right about the violence of policing, then that lack of trust is actually something that's appropriate for the situation. That is, if we understand policing as designed to maintain a social order which is unequal or based in domination, then the goal of trust is the wrong thing to be looking for. And instead we should be trying to make that conflict more explicit, to bring it out and visualize it.
Thank you. Let's see, next question here. Do you think the difference between Black Lives Matter protest and white supremacist violence can be boiled down to law-making violence versus law-preserving violence, if you accept the premise that white supremacy is inherent in American law?
Oh, I love this question. Could you read that one more time?
Sure. Do you think the difference between Black Lives Matter protest and white supremacist violence can be boiled down to law-making violence versus law-preserving violence, if you accept the premise that white supremacy is inherent in American law?
Okay, great, yeah. So I think that the most important part of that question comes at the very end, which is if you accept the premise that white supremacy is inherent in American law, which is something that I do. And this is the centerpiece of the book that I wrote 2 years ago. I guess what I would say is this. The point of my talk was actually to show that in both cases, whether it's Black Lives Matter protests or the white nationalists storming the Capitol, in both cases, we're looking at something that is law-making. It's juris genesis. It's a creation of a new kind of legal meaning. And it's set out against the state, where the state is jurispacific. Its goal is, in fact, to beat it down. The reason that that might seem especially confusing in this case is because the white nationalism of the crowd is in some way mirrored in the fact of white supremacy in the police. So one might think about, in fact, what the protesters at the Capitol were doing as simply law preserving. And I think there's something right about that. But there's also a distinction that I would want to make in response to the question. And that is that there are different, we might call them different regimes of white supremacy. They're different manners of maintaining white supremacist political rule. And what we see in the civil rights movement example was that split took place roughly between the forces of massive resistance on the one hand that were open and explicit, and the moderates in the middle who called themselves moderates. And what made them moderate was a desire to maintain a white supremacist order, but to do so in a more humane looking way. So token integration, privatization, not the Klan. And I think that there's a similar kind of split here, which is to say that the sort of white supremacy that's on offer from the Capitol Hill insurrectionists is a different kind of white supremacy than the ordinary operation of the law. And I don't think that breaks down entirely along racial lines. They might both be equally white supremacists. I think it was Du Bois who said that in America, the question was never whether whites would rule, the question is which whites would rule. And I think we might have an echo of that here, which is to say, there is something really bad for business in the kind of white supremacy that's on offer, either from massive resistance or from the Capitol insurrectionists. And so the goal of the policing as we understand it now is to maintain a white supremacist social order, but without the kind of disruption and chaos that that mucks up the processes of capitalism and finance, I think I would say. Great question.
Let's see, don't see another question here. Again, if you have a question, just type it into the Q&A and I'm happy to read it. Maybe we'll give folks a chance to formulate a question here, Mark, and maybe I'll pose another one to you. So I want to take us back to 2016, and maybe just do a thought experiment. In 2016, President Trump wins the election by legitimate constitutional means, the Electoral College, but it's a radically anti-democratic mechanism. That is, he loses the popular vote, and yet nonetheless, as a matter of the rule of law, assumes the executive office. if in 2016 there had been an armed insurrection from the left to prevent the certification of the Electoral College, would you have cheered that on and said yes, or would you have offered a critique, but offered a critique in something other than the rule of law?
I can see, Jack, that you really want to pin me down on the question of violence as a political tactic.
I'm simply asking a simple question.
and I appreciate it, I guess I should say. So to think back to 2016 and Trump winning by, as you put it, legitimate constitutional means, I think I want to say to that both yes and no. Legitimate in the sense that you described, that is the Electoral College, the orderly process of elections and counting of votes, and illegitimate in another more fundamental way, which is to say, if you take account of like the large sections of the population who are disenfranchised through whether it's from felon disenfranchisement or voter purges or the other, right? So, but leaving aside that question, if we accept the legitimacy of the 2016 election, I think at that point it was too early to really know what Trumpism represented, right? And my answer, as will always be the case, is to deflect away from the question of whether one should cheer an armed insurrection or not. That would be to accept the frame of should we be violent or shouldn't we? And instead, I would think about what sorts of political strategies would make clear the kinds of structural violence that occurs even within the ordinary constitutional process. So I'd have to think more about, I mean, I guess I should say, I did take to the streets in 2016, but they were fairly friendly protests. They put millions of bodies in the street, and then we went home. And I guess I'd have to think more about what would have happened if all of us had stayed in the street and just refused to go. And I wouldn't want to pitch that in terms of a violent insurrection. I would want to pitch that maybe in the same way that MLK described nonviolent direct action, or the kinds of civil rights protesting that Robert Cover most admired, which is by putting one's body in the street, you can force judges or police or other agents of the state to choose between the law that they enforce, which they come to recognize as an act of violence, or the law that's on offer coming up from the streets. My guess is in 2016, there would not have been anything like the kind of organized force necessary to make agents of the state recognize the significance, necessity of the nomos generating from the protests. Although I think in 2020, there would have been. So I'll propose a different thought experiment, which is what if Trump had claimed the White House and refused to leave and surrounded it with the Proud Boys and said, we'll find out whether the military is going to remove us or not. This would be exactly the kind of test of what Robert Cover calls interpretive commitment. And that commitment is not separated out from violent physical processes. So in those moments, I know that there was a huge amount of organizing on the left to confront exactly that potentiality. And the idea was, in 2020, if Trump doesn't leave the White House, then to occupy everything and force people to choose.
Great, thank you. I have another question here in the Q&A box. Trump's final tweets called on the protesters not to use violence and to cooperate with police, saying something like that, quote, "we are the party of law and order," end quote. Do you think rule of law rhetoric can be used strategically to suppress violence from the far right?
So the question does two things. First, it names a tweet from the president. So Trump especially is really good at this sort of like double language, right? He'll foment protests, he'll incite violence, he'll encourage it, he'll cheer for violence, he'll talk about how we should be acting in violent ways, including murderously. And then he'll turn around and say, oh, but we're the party of law and order, so we don't mean that. I think I want to say in response to this question that as a strategy, using the language of the rule of law to condemn the white nationalists or militia protesters is not only misleading intellectually, but I think it's a misstep politically as well, right? And the reason that I say that is because I think it misunderstands the nature of the problem. When Trump tweets that Republicans are the party of law and order, in part, he's responding to the terrible optics which are starting to look like a real contradiction. That is, in the lead up to the election, he'd been so pro-police and had been demonizing protests against police violence, showing over and over and over on an endless loop the kind of like what he called rioting or lawlessness, which he associated with blackness and justified police violence as a response to these sorts of actions. So it looks like just a total flip, right? But it is only a flip or only a contradiction if you accept the premise that he in fact lost the election and was trying to steal it in the form of a coup, right? So his language was designed to do exactly the opposite, which was to insist upon the legality of, right? So from his point of view, he can have both at the same time. He can say that we're the party of law and order, and he can mean it even as he mobilizes people to take to the Capitol building. So, so when I say that denouncing those right-wing actions with language of lawlessness is going to be not up to the task, is to say that in denouncing the insurrectionists in that way, it locates the problem in the particular actions that they took. Like they should have come and protested, but not done so violently. They should have symbolically called for the hanging of Mike Pence, but not in a context where he could actually get, strung up or something like that. In which case the problem is actually quite small, right? It's like they stepped over the line. But I think that we're facing a different kind of problem in America today, and that is a really deep-seated rise of right-wing populism and a real commitment to this alternative nomos, to a nomos of white nationalism in its explicit forms, in its most brutal versions. And I can't imagine that that will go away simply by denouncing it as lawless. I think if anything, that kind of language makes it burrow down to people who are all the more committed to a kind of alternative law that again, I of course recoil from.
Wonderful, thank you. I think at this point we maybe need to close down the conversation. Mark, I wish you were here in Walla Walla and we could actually just have a 2-hour seminar to discuss, because I think we're really just scratching the surface of some really complicated questions. So I just want to thank you again so much for joining us virtually. It was a really wonderfully thought-provoking talk. And for those who are out there watching, I just want to give a plug for the book. It's called Is Racial Equality Unconstitutional? And it's published by Oxford University Press. And it's a wonderfully smart book, which will help you, I think, look at American law in a new light. So plug for the book and gratitude from Walla Walla.
Thank you so much, Jack. I really appreciate the invitation. It was great talking with you.
Wonderful. Take good care.